Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So a little bit of a different video today. I know I've seen a lot of questions over the past few months, maybe even years, around the science behind perfumes. And I know I put some ask out to you guys to let me know what your different scientific questions would be if you were to talk to a perfume scientist. So I thought it would be really cool to introduce you to Nic Mastenbroek, who is one of my perfumers, and he's going to answer your questions and sort of give us the lowdown on the actual science behind perfume. So cool. So Nic, maybe if you just sort of introduce yourself a little bit.
So hi everyone, my name's Nic. As Sophie mentioned, I'm an independent perfumer where I create fragrances for brands like Sophie's and lots of other mainly British brands, fine fragrance, candles, diffusers, skincare, everything really fragrance related, and genuinely love fragrance. And so yeah, excited to answer some of these questions today.
Yeah, absolutely. And your mom is of course Ruth Mastenbroek, who is also a perfumer for my perfumes, but of course has her own perfume range as well.
Yes, absolutely. So Ruth was luckily enough my mum and my trainer, my mentor, and Ruth has been a perfumer for over 40 years. And I think one of the questions is about how you get into perfumery. She trained with what became Givaudan, which is one of the biggest perfume houses in the world, and was fortunate enough to train with some of the best perfumers in the world, Olivier Cresp being kind of the primary one. So some of how she has trained me was how she was trained also by Olivier Cresp. And I've still got some of his kind of notebooks and perfumery trading notes.
No way!
Yeah, it's quite amazing to see.
So if you guys don't know, Olivier Cresp is one of the most famous perfumers, maybe the most famous perfumer. Yeah. He was part of the original team that created Angel, Original Angel. And he's created hundreds of perfumes. He's still doing ones today. In fact, he now has his own range, Acro. And for example, he created the new Dolce & Gabbana Devotion, which you guys know I love, and the Intense version. So that's so cool. And I do actually have a video on my favorite creations from him. So check that out if you want to find out more. But Nic, maybe if we take a step back, what is a perfumer? Can anyone just be a perfumer? Is there a qualification? How does it work?
Yeah, this is one of those funny things. There's no real qualification, really, and that it's a little bit of a bugbear of ours, I suppose, because there has been a lot of mystery in the perfume industry, and frankly, you do get people passing them off as perfumers. I can think of two instantly.
I know who you're thinking of.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a couple, and it's convenient for someone who has a brand, a perfume brand, for people to think they are a perfumer. But for me, a perfumer is a creator of a fragrance. And you don't need to be trained in a classical way like I have been now. You don't have to have that.
So when you say classical way, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, there's different ways that you can learn about the basics of perfumery, if you like, or you can learn to become a perfumer. So the classical methodology, which is kind of the way I've been trained now, is I've learned the individual smells of, say, 600 or 700 individual ingredients, and then you build up from those as the kind of building blocks. You start then making simple combinations of ingredients to create a rose fragrance or a jasmine, and you sort of build up your foundations through individual accords and combinations of ingredients to then develop further to making more complex fragrances. Versus, someone who is maybe self-taught wouldn't have access to so many ingredients, and they might already start off by their learning through making fragrances, simple fragrances or formulas that they then build out to more complex. Yeah, it's really that kind of the starting off with very basic foundational principles, which is kind of the classical methodology.
Okay. Yeah, because like, for example, I couldn't just buy a load of chemicals online, make a perfume, and then sell it to the general public, right? Like, A, I wouldn't know how, but B, there's a lot of regulations around some perfume because, you know, you put it on your skin, it's cosmetic.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, in theory, you could do that. You would, you would be. As soon as you start selling, that is where the restrictions and the regulations really come in. You know, if you're making something for yourself, for your own consumption, really, there's no one really policing that, to be honest. So and you can, but as soon as you start selling, you know, that's where you open yourself up possibly for kind of liability if anything goes wrong. So that's when you need to be complying with the regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think before we dive into the actual questions, I think one thing I've seen people comment on is, I guess, you know, so for example, like on Fragrantica, like yourself and Ruth are listed as the perfumer for like Artemis, my new fragrance. So, but I guess some people ask, so does that mean like you just say to them, I want to make a new fragrance, and you guys just go away and make a new fragrance for me, and I'm not like involved at all, because I'm not the perfumer. So I guess like, what's the difference between like the brand owner and the perfumer, in terms of like who comes up with the fragrance? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I suppose it works in different ways. I think for me, it's almost like a duo. You know, you as the brand owner have the vision of what you're looking to create and the idea behind the fragrance, and then you need help to bring that to life in a fragrance. So one without the other just won't work. So you need both of those parties. But I suppose some brand owners are less involved than you. Some brand owners are less knowledgeable about fragrance as you. So they will struggle to articulate so well what they want more or less of, you know, during that process. So the level of involvement can vary. And I'd say you have quite a specific idea on not necessarily how you execute it. You don't have the background in the training, but you've got the specific end goal in mind of what you want. So if it's not there yet, you know how to kind of express that.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense, definitely. And I guess also you mentioned briefly before Givaudan. So, you know, for people that don't know, like if you buy a fragrance from Dolce & Gabbana, it hasn't been made in the Dolce & Gabbana like head office in Milan or wherever it is. Like brands tend to license their name out to big companies like Unilever or Procter & Gamble, Estee Lauder, and then they will hire these big companies like Givaudan who have perfumers working for them who will then create the fragrance. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, and some of the bigger brands, they might have one fragrance house that they typically use. Sometimes they'll put out a brief to 2 or 3 fragrance houses, and you know, they'll kind of choose the best of the submissions that they get. And then there are a couple of brands, you know, you think of Hermes, which has an in-house perfumer. Now, Christian Dior. Yeah, so some brands do have an in-house perfumer, but I'd say that is pretty rare these days.
Okay, super. So let's dive into your questions here. First question from Grace Mimo is, do perfumes expire, and if so, after how long? How do you find the expiration dates?
So good question. Yeah, the perfumes do have a an expiration date. Typically, you should see somewhere on the packaging a little kind of cosmetics jar with a number inside. It might say 12M or 24M, and that means the how many months will this product last from when I open it? In theory, that is what it means.
So is that from your first spray?
Yeah, from your first spray. I mean, that's because from a regulatory point of view, you have to put something, and that is typically a very safe, amount of time that someone could put on there. So 24 months, for example, from your first spray. Having said that, it does really depend on how a fragrance is stored. There's two big factors that have an impact on how quickly a fragrance degrades. One is sunlight, and so UV light, which has the biggest impact really on a fragrance and can cause it to degrade more quickly. So if you can keep it in a dark or away from sunlight is the main one. And then also in a cool place, so not in a very warm room or area. So, if a fragrance has been kept in poor conditions, then it could deteriorate more quickly. But if it is kept in a cool, dark place, most fragrances will last significantly more than 24 months.
I think we've all got perfumes that are older than 2 years, right? And when you say degrade, do you mean it will start smelling like off or weird, or it will stop smelling at all?
Yeah, I mean, it could discolor for a start, and then it's likely to, UV light could trigger some reactions, kind of chemical reactions in the fragrance, just to mean it doesn't smell like it did when it was kind of first opened. So it will just start to not smell as good. And also, especially when there's a lot of citrus notes or more volatile notes, which I think one of the questions later will come on to that. Those notes don't last so well, especially when a product's been opened or it's exposed to kind of some of those elements like heat or sunlight.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. Yeah. So there was a question. There's question from Marta. Why aren't fresh scents long lasting? Why can't more perfume concentration just be added to increase projection and longevity? And I think there was another question here as well around citrus. Yeah, so do you want to, so why are things like citrus and fresh scents like just not as long lasting as heavy woody ones or something?
Well, there was another question on why perfumes, certain notes come out at different times. And I guess this is all part of the same topic, really, is because all of the ingredients that we use in a fragrance essentially are chemicals, whether it's a natural chemical, an essential oil, and within that there's lots of different components, or it's a singular synthetic ingredient. That each chemical or essential oil will have kind of properties within that, the color, the smell, but also the volatility. And that is the biggest kind of driver of how long something will last. Whether that's on a smelling strip or on your skin. So how quickly will a fragrance, the more volatile, something is, the quicker it's kind of popping off your skin, or it's evaporating essentially. So you're smelling that first. Exactly. Things like lemon and orange, grapefruit, mandarin, etc., citrus notes, also some of the herbal notes, fruity notes, those are more volatile molecules, essentially chemicals. So they will evaporate the quicker. So you're going to smell those first. And that is why citrus, heavily citrus fragrances, where there's a lot of those ingredients, a lot of that is, you're losing it quite quickly.
Right, so just adding more wouldn't make it evaporate slower.
Exactly. It might well have an impact. You could increase the dosage and it would be stronger. It might last a little bit longer just because there's more fragrance oils, but it won't have as much of an impact on the longevity as changing the structure of the fragrance and having less proportionately of those top citrusy notes.
Okay, yeah. With Aphrodite, you did an amazing job of creating that mango note that does stay past the top note into the middle, and that's something I've not ever found before from a mango or like a fresh fruit. So that would be to do with the composition of the fragrance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So, and you're right, because a lot of fruity notes and fruity fragrances can be quite fleeting. There's a lovely burst of that fresh fruitiness, but then it goes quite quickly.
Yeah.
But the secret is in how do you then kind of elongate that through the heart notes and the base notes so that you're retaining that fruitiness for longer.
So a question here from literally Heather. I'd be curious to know your opinion on niche brands. Does the quality of ingredients they use justify the 2 or 3 times cost over designer fragrances? Or is it more a matter of the fact that they're not mass produced and therefore cost more?
Yeah, that's a, very, what's the word? Very good observation. Let's put it like that. To point out that you're right. Typically niche brands, they're producing far less than the mass brands. So there's an element of kind of economies of scale. Also, not just on the fragrance, but on the components, boxes and all of those things that do add to the cost of a product. But, one thing to point out, depends what type of niche brand we're talking, how niche. Some of the niche brands now have either been bought by big companies, or typically as well, niche brands they're not the fragrance creators, a lot of them. So they will also be going to a Givaudan or a big fragrance house, or, someone like us, but bigger, where we have access to economies of scale through producing larger quantities. So it's not like necessarily because they're producing a lower amount, they're just buying in those specific ingredients and producing only what they're making. They're accessing a much larger pool of ingredients. So I think that question, it does vary by brand and even by fragrance. But I would say typically, yes, it is true that niche brands do invest a lot more in their perfume than the mass brands. And that's just largely because of, I think, the commercial aspect that the big brands, the mass brands, they're so driven by the commercials that the budget that they have on a fragrance is actually not very high.
And I think, I guess we had also a few questions around like quality, like what's good quality and stuff. And I remember seeing someone review Aphrodite and say that they thought it was poor quality, and I'd skipped on quality and you'd be better off getting a Britney Spears fragrance. And I guess, how do you define what is good quality, what's bad quality? Like, how would you define it?
For me, the ingredients, especially, we work with a large French fragrance house on the manufacturing of our perfumes. And so we use the same ingredients that they use, and we know they produce for some of the biggest brands in the world. So we know we're using the same quality, good, high quality ingredients as our French manufacturer, and they are using the same quality as, the Givaudan's of this world. There will be some exceptions where some of the big manufacturers, they own certain growing, and they'll own their own rose fields or stuff. So there's an element of control over that. But I would say, the quality of the ingredients when you're talking about the big companies is pretty similar. So then we're talking about the quality of the fragrance, and really in perfume, like a lot of things, you get what you pay for. So a Britney Spears fragrance, I imagine the quality is in the price of how much is spent on the fragrance juice, if you like, is probably not that high.
And the percentage of concentration of fragrance oil versus like how much are typically like eau de parfums, what percentage is perfume oil and what percentage is water and alcohol and all the rest?
Yeah, so typically an eau de parfum would say be anything above 15%, typically 15 to 20%, and that's, yeah, Britney Spears fragrance. I don't know if they're eau de parfum or eau de toilette, but say it's eau de parfum and it's 15%, but then for instance, your fragrance is Sophie eau de parfum, but it's 30%, you're instantly getting double the amount and a higher price fragrance. So yeah, that stuff is not so easily, talked about, or it's not so widely talked about, is it? The dosage, but that does have a big impact on value for money.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's not something the brands publish. So next question here from Lally Dirar. Why do some notes smell different in different fragrances? For example, jasmine and sandalwood.
This is another one where, and there was another question about listed notes, so the notes that you'll see on a website, and it's kind of links a little bit to this example formula.
Yes. So Nic has an example that I can bring up on screen now, an example of a formula. This is for one of Ruth's perfumes, is it? Or
no, this is just an example. Kind of, I haven't even made it, to be honest, but I would quite like to now. I just put it together earlier.
Oh, so it's like a made-up example.
Yeah, it's a made-up one.
Oh, thanks.
Just because I wouldn't want to share the.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
This one is, a typical length. So there's about I think is about 40 ingredients.
Yeah.
The ingredients is the middle column, the name. So those are all of the individual ingredients that make up the fragrance. And on the left side, I've done this kind of category. Which category do those ingredients fall into? Some of them are natural. Some of these are synthetic ingredients, are found in nature. So linalool acetate, for example, is found in bergamot oil and lavender oil. There's a kind of some crossover, let's say, between natural and synthetic ingredients.
Synthetic is sometimes used as a real negative descriptive word when it comes to perfume. Like, do you think that's fair? Do you think a synthetic ingredient is going to smell not as good or not last compared to natural?
No, yeah, this has definitely been a trend over the last couple of years, or maybe even more than that, where it seems people think natural is immediately better than synthetic. But the reality is, we talk about organic chemistry and perfume, that how things are structured. Everything is a chemical. Even essential oils are chemicals. They're more complex chemicals. Right. So there's within an essential oil, there's lots of individual sub chemicals, if you like. Some of those we can use as individual ingredients in perfumery. So there's no real distinction whether it comes from an essential oil or from a synthetic source. But an essential oil has got, because of that complexity they've got hundreds potentially of sub-chemicals, there's a kind of richness and a sophistication and a complexity that you don't get from an individual synthetic component. So if there is a fragrance that is it's only synthetics and it's not done in a great way, then I can understand the connotation of, synthetics don't smell great. But used in the right way, and potentially with some natural oils to complement them, then you wouldn't know the difference.
Right. And there are some smells or chords or notes that you can't get from nature, right? Like maybe like apple or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's certain ingredients where there is no natural oil of. There's no apple oil that we can use, for instance, or certain flowers. There's no essential oil of the flower. But so therefore we have to recreate the impression of those ingredients with synthetic substitutions, or potentially with some natural oils of a different type.
Right, yeah. And of course the carbon footprint as well of creating something in a lab versus, growing flowers in a field, and the supply chain and transporting them across the world must be a massive difference.
And a lot of the essential oils or natural ingredients that they're produced through steam distillation.
Yes.
So there's a lot of water that is needed, not just in the growing of the flowers as well, the watering flowers, but then the steam distillation process, the energy used, and for a kilo of rose, it's something like, I want to say, a ton of rose petals. We might have to fact check this, but it's something like a ton of rose petals to produce 1 kilo of essential oil. So if you think about
yeah, and I mean, jasmine's quite a good example. Like, there are so many jasmine perfumes, but they smell very different. And sometimes it's described as, jasmine sambac or night blooming jasmine and things like that. Yeah. How does that work?
Yeah, so that's, I guess, one of the things with this formula I wanted to show is, so if we look at the floral notes in this formula, there's benzyl acetate, which is a component of jasmine. You've got jasmine absolute with citronellol, which is a component of rose. Then we've got rose absolute, the natural rose. Cyclamax is a synthetic kind of fresh air ingredient. Geraniol is a component of rose. Helianal is a very fresh, almost like lily of the valley type notes, same as floral and magnolan. And then hedione is found in jasmine. So that, there's some rosy, kind of peony, lily of the valley, muguet, jasmine. You could even say, jasmine and ylang are sometimes kind of used interchangeably. So from that kind of group of flower notes, I could, in the notes, when I come to describe that in the marketing, I could describe this as jasmine, rose, lily of the valley. I could describe it as ylang, peony, even carnation, because there's some other spicy notes in the fragrance. And I suppose what I wanted to show is there's a lot of creative license in and there's so many different ingredients. This is only a few. There's so many different ingredients I could use to portray a jasmine that, and sometimes I might say there's jasmine, but actually it's more of an illusion of jasmine through some of the notes. So there's a slight impression of jasmine because I've used a touch of the benzyl acetate, for instance, or even a bit of hedione, which, if you smelled on its own, doesn't really smell of much, but it is a component of jasmine. Wow. So it can be quite misleading, the notes, based on what is actually in the formula. And therefore, a jasmine, it also depends on what other ingredients are in there, the combinations. So you might, basically, a jasmine in one fragrance could smell completely different to a jasmine in another because of everything else that's going on in the fragrance and how the perfumer or the marketing team has decided to bring it to life through the notes they've described.
So there's no official definition to come up with the notes. It's purely how the brand wants to describe it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And what they want to highlight. And, on the second page, so the rest of this fragrance, you've got floral notes, got some green notes, citrus, spicy, musk, amber, woods. And then on the second page, I've just shown as an example, you could use almost 3 different groups to decide the same fragrance. Your top notes you could say lemon, lime, apple, and the heart could be rose, muguet, peony, base, cedarwood, amber, musk. But from the same formula, you could describe it as sea salt, orange and peach, jasmine, peony, carnation, sandalwood, vetiver, and amber. Or even if you're going a bit more kind of creative, yuzu, grapefruit, and basil, because there's some green notes, gardenia, which ties in some of the green notes from the basil, the lily and hyacinth. And you could say oak, because there's some woody notes, amberwood, and Egyptian musk.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and that, you could probably come up with 3 more from the same formula.
Gosh, that's crazy. Wow, I love that fact, Nic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to sort of lift the lid of behind the scenes, how
it's so interesting. And there was a question actually from Curly Girl around the solar note, which keeps popping up in a lot of new releases. Now, obviously, the sun doesn't smell, or if it did, I'm not sure we could smell it. So what is a solar note?
Yeah, solar, like you say, is linked to the sun, the sunshine, brightness. So typically, it's true. There's definitely been a trend towards more solar notes. But for me, solar notes, you've got kind of ozonic, what we call ozonic notes, so fresh air type ingredients. You know, cologne is a very popular kind of ozonic note, for instance. So there's typically would have an element of that ozonic, potentially slightly aquatic, fresh air notes with some citrus, you know, lemon, mandarin, orange, potentially grapefruit.
And can be a bit sweet as well, this solar note, right? Like often they say it's got frangipani notes in there as well. Like
Yeah, I guess, you know, you got that yellow flower connotation, that the slight sweetness. Oh, because I also see it could be a kind of an orange blossom, orange flower, neroli note, which also has that kind of yellowy connotation or dusky orange with a touch of sweetness. So yeah, that's how I would portray the solar notes. But you know, that again, that could be very different for me as a perfumer to another perfumer who some of those notes would be similar, but how they would actually create that in a formula would be very different. So it would smell very different in different fragrances.
So it's purely a descriptive term. It's not like a new invention or new chemical or something.
No, yeah, just a description of a collection of ingredients.
Okay, that's really interesting. We have another question here around how long can water-based perfumes last? How does it affect longevity, and does it limit the notes that it can have? I mean, I know Dior came out with their J'adore Eau, water-based J'adore perfume, and I personally found it really didn't perform very well compared to normal original J'adore, so I wasn't that impressed. So I guess a water-based perfume doesn't have alcohol in, right? Do you think it limits how good a fragrance can be in terms of lasting and projection?
Yeah, I think this has been one that has come up more recently. I think people maybe becoming more conscious of putting, you know, alcohol on their skin or potential environmental reasons. For whatever, or religious reasons. People thinking about what other alternatives. And, you know, the key thing with a water-based perfume, like you say, there's no alcohol. Alcohol mixes very well with lots of basically all perfumery ingredients that we use. Whereas water and oil typically don't mix. Yeah. So especially essential oils, a lot of essential oils won't mix with water. Typically you're looking at more synthetic ingredients to use in a water-based perfume. However, there are kind of chemicals, if you like, called solubilizers, which will aid and some oils going into water. So that can help with some. And also then with water, you've got the potential kind of bacterial growth that you won't get with an alcoholic perfume. So there's typically I can't think of the word now, like a bactericide almost, that are added to these water-based perfumes to stop mold and bacteria growing. But I would say it limits how long it's going to last more, you know, than an alcohol-based perfume.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Yeah, so it does limit things. And we also had a question around this, is it civets or civet notes and musks? Because I know these were ingredients that were used in things like the original Chanel No. 5, and they're extracts from like glands of small animal rodents and things, aren't they? And I think it's banned now, right?
Yeah, it's a civet. It's the civet cat, which is it was civet absolute, I think, as it was called, was taken from the secretions from these glands.
I mean, who discovered that?
I don't know, but yeah, I've seen pictures of civet cats kept in captivity, reared for this, and that is obviously why it's been banned, and rightly so. Um, and that's why civet is it's a very if you smell it on its own, it's very animalic. It's very almost fecal, if that's the right way of saying it. It actually smells really horrible. When you dilute it down, it's got this kind of warm, sweet, musky, ambery smell, which has a can be obviously have its place in certain fragrances. But yeah, that's why the natural civet is not used any longer. But there are synthetic replacements that
Right.
don't smell the same, of course, but give enough of a feeling of civet. But yeah, that is, there was a question on why some, I think, around something like why do fragrances change so much over time, from when they were first released so many years ago. And part of it is things like that, ingredients that aren't used. Part of it will be commercial, just much less naturals used. And, the fragrance is much less expensive than it used to be. And just the natural change of kind of natural ingredients over time.
Yeah, like one of the inspirations for Artemis was the original Gucci Flora, right? And you tested it in the lab and you found that it had banned ingredients in it, which will have been why it's been discontinued.
Yeah, exactly. And in some fragrances, those trying to replace those ingredients can be almost impossible, especially Lyrau and Lilial, the two ingredients. Like, luckily, in a way, I came into the industry as they were already being banned, so I didn't get used to using them. But I've had to replace those in certain fragrances, and it's almost one in particular. And I was speaking to another perfumer about it, and he was saying it's almost like the garlic of a meal, and you're trying to replace garlic as in cooking is just impossible. I know some perfumers don't like that side of regulation, but obviously it's there for a reason.
So just a couple more questions for you here, Nic. So there's a few questions around like so CosmoCat12 says, how come some perfumes can cause an instant headache? And there was another question around like, can perfumes affect like teenage hormones? I think I've seen marketing around pheromone perfumes. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, so I mean the headaches, it's this can be very personal. I think depends. I wouldn't say there's one fragrance that causes a headache for everyone.
No.
It might be that it causes a headache for one person. It might be linked to other things that are going on for them, or it might be that they've got a sensitivity to a certain ingredient. But as the kind of what I sent you shows, it can be really hard because you take a fragrance formula, and then what goes on the packaging from a regulatory perspective is the allergens. But the allergens isn't or potential allergens, I should say. It's not an exhaustive list of ingredients that are in the fragrance. So the allergens might not list an ingredient that is in the fragrance that actually is causing someone a headache, because they have a very certain specific sensitivity to it. So it can be really hard to kind of get to the bottom of what is it in that fragrance that is causing the headache. So yeah, all I can say is probably to avoid that fragrance, unfortunately.
And what about like pheromones and hormones and perfume?
Yeah, I mean the hormones. So hormone, I think the key thing with hormones is for a teenager, for instance, the perfume industry, rightly so, is very heavily regulated from an end point of, how much can a fragrance be put in a dosed at, 20%, 30%, what's allowed in the end state. But the ingredients that we use, the individual ingredients, are also regulated. And there's various bodies. There's IFRA that oversees it, but also RIFM, which they govern the kind of individual chemicals that we use in perfumery, and they look at things like impact on hormones. So there are certain things, called endocrine disruptors. So, and where chemicals that can kind of mimic or block certain hormones in the body.
Wow.
But these are things like parabens and phthalates, which, that's why typically maybe more used in beauty products, but
Right.
where, that those are often claims, doesn't contain parabens or phthalates. And that is the reason for that. So in perfume itself, we don't have such a problem with that. But having said that, certain ingredients are, they're constantly evaluated for this. So I would say it's safe to use fragrances because of the regulation that's in place and what is being used in a perfume. And also, if there is something that is potentially harmful, it's a persistent exposure to that.
Right.
And I think, the amount that we're putting on our skins every now and then, or even every day, it's not going to build up into such a dramatic exposure that it could have an impact.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then, and pheromones, I can answer that one as well if you like.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's because we started getting questions on it from journalists probably about a year ago, really. Suddenly we're getting questions from a few different people. And clearly it had been a bit of a trend. And so the funny thing is there's no evidence even that humans produce pheromones.
Yeah.
There's no concrete evidence, scientific evidence. So the pheromone perfumes that are marketed, they're actually often contain pig pheromones. So there's, it's a bit of a stretch to say they would have an impact on humans when we don't even know if we produce or perceive pheromones.
But it might make you more attractive to a pig.
Yeah, if that's what you're into.
If that's what you're looking for, then.
Yeah, exactly. But having said that, while there's no evidence, there's also no evidence to contradict it because there's no concrete evidence. So it's kind of like further information is needed, but it does seem to me far-fetched. Having said that, it seems like there could be a bit of a placebo effect as well, whether you feel more confident.
Sure.
Because certainly I've heard, read stories of it being very successful, but I don't, you've also read as many stories saying it didn't do a thing. So
yeah, it's anecdotal. Yeah. Okay. And then lastly, Nic, I had a few questions around like, how do you become a perfumer? How do you get involved in like the science side of fragrance? So what would be your advice to someone who's interested in becoming a perfumer?
Yeah, I always feel bad answering this one because, I'm very fortunate that my mum is a perfumer.
And that's quite common, right? Like often families, people are from that family history. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially in France, you get second, third generation perfumers, maybe even more. So obviously that is quite a restrictive, criteria. Not everyone's going to have that. And I read something somewhere that says there's less perfumers in the world than there are astronauts.
Feel very special.
Yeah. Well, no, I do feel fortunate to have had the opportunity that I've had. But I think obviously there are other ways now, and typical one, like I mentioned for Ruth, my mum, she joined a fragrance company, and she received training to become a perfumer that way.
But she'd already studied chemistry at university. Yeah.
She studied chemistry, so studying chemistry can, for anyone who's still at that stage of their lives, it can be an advantage. Now they do look for that much more. I think, I read story. I'm not a trained chemist. I have had to learn through my job, but I didn't do a chemistry degree. But I know, 40, 50 years ago, some of the best perfumers in history, they didn't have a chemistry background. But nowadays, I think, if you're applying for companies, they do look for more chemistry backgrounds. So that is a good place to start. Having said that, it's not fundamentally, it's not a kind of be all and end all. You can go to a perfumery school as well. There's perfumery, the most famous one of them being is Sipka in Paris. And through that, they have affiliations with companies that you can then get placements at. And the one that you see more and more now is kind of the self-taught route, where people will buy ingredients themselves and start to play around with creating their own fragrances. That is an option, and there's a lot more kind of training available online and things like that. So those 3 routes to get into perfumery. Another route, I think, depending on what stage people are at, there are fragrance companies where you wouldn't expect to necessarily get a job in perfumery, but you might be able to get a job in the lab, whether you're compounding for a perfumer, so you're taking their fragrance formula and you're making it for them. You can getting a foot in the door, let's put it that way, into something related to fragrance, and then maneuvering it over time once you've kind of built up some experience and credibility into a more perfumery related job. That seems to be a good way of going about it now.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's super helpful for people, Nic. Thanks so much.
Okay.
So I think those are all the questions. Is there anything else you'd want to add on perfume science or anything else?
No, I'm really enjoyed answering those questions and thinking about them. So thanks to everyone who sent me those. I think we've kind of covered a lot of different bases, haven't we? I can't think of anything specific right now.
Well, Cleopatra has been listening to the entire thing, haven't you, love? So I expect you to be an expert now. But yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks so much for your time, Nic. And thanks to everyone that put the questions in. I think if you would like to see something like this again, if you have more questions, do let me know in the comments. And I'm sure we could do it again in the future if there are lots of additional questions. And we will be doing a video on Artemis specifically soon as well. So that's exciting. But yeah, thank you so much, Nic, for your time and for answering the questions so well.
Oh, my pleasure. That has been fun. So thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, guys. Bye.